problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
All right. Welcome everyone to the second in a series of Romantic Circle's Pedagogies Hangout. The Pedagogies Hangouts brings together scholars and teachers of Romanticism at all levels to talk about the possibilities and challenges of teaching in the 21st century. For this hangout, I suggested to Kate Singer that we focus on Donald Ault, a scholar whose interdisciplinary record stretches the boundaries of his training in British Romanticism to encompass critical theory, comics, media studies, animation, and game studies, just to mention a few. And before we get started, please let me thank Laura Ault and Walton Wood, who helped Don participate by setting up an audio interview with him. We'll be featuring clips from that interview in this discussion today. So Donald Ault is probably best known to audiences of Romantic circles for his two monographs on the British poet and printer William Blake. The first is Visionary Physics, Blake's Response to Newton, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 1972. And the second is the massive narrative Unbound, revisioning William Blake's The Four Zoas, published by Station Hill in 1987. In addition to many groundbreaking articles on the relationship between Blake, narrative, and science and technology studies. But he's also well known for his groundbreaking work on the Donald Duck artist Carl Barks, having served as consultant and contributor to the Carl Barks Library of Walt Disney's Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge from 1983 to 1990, the executive producer and editorial supervisor for the film The Duck Man, an interview with Carl Barks in 1996, and the editor of Carl Barks Conversations in 2003. Most recently, he wrote the introduction and contributed notes to the first volume of Fantagraphics series, The Complete Carl Barks Disney Library, which is entitled Lost in the Andes. It's a great book.
Actually, yeah,
all of this is in addition to his establishment of the first journal dedicated to comics and critical theory, titled Image Text, Interdisciplinary Comic Studies. Image Text began in 2004 and continues to publish groundbreaking work today. So this is sort of a necessarily abbreviated list of Ault's numerous scholarly achievements, but I wanted to give you a sense of the truly broad and interdisciplinary scope of his research, and the reason why I selected people from various parts of academia to represent his work. I've gathered several of his former or rather eternal students today from a wide variety of fields. I'll introduce them here before getting to the format of today's program, and I'll start with myself because I too am a student of Ault's. So, my name is Roger Whitson. I'm an assistant professor of English at Washington State University, where I also teach in the Digital Technology and Culture undergraduate program. My research focuses on the reception of 19th century literature and media, particularly as they complicate normative modes of reading literary and technological history. And I'll introduce the rest of the scholars today in alphabetical order by their last names. So, Ron Broglio is an associate professor at Arizona State University and senior scholar at the university's Global Institute of Sustainability. His research focuses on how philosophy and aesthetics can help us rethink the relationship between humans and the environment. He's author of a number of books and edited collections and curator of several exhibitions. Throughout, Broglio considers how a speculative non-human phenomenology can transform our thinking and dwelling. Toph Eklund is a lecturer in Auckland University's of Technology's English and New Media program. They specialize in comics, games, and queer media studies, and their work includes creative writing and gaming projects as well as scholarship. Lori N. Taylor is the digital scholarship librarian at the University of Florida. In addition to developing the cyber infrastructure of the UF Library, Taylor leads several digital scholarship initiatives, including most famously the Digital Library of the Caribbean. She has also published widely in video game studies and in the digital humanities. Zach Whalen is an associate professor teaching digital studies at the University of Mary Washington and Fredericksburg, Virginia. He researches and teaches courses on digital culture, graphic narrative, and electronic literature, and he likes to make Twitter bots. which are awesome. His Twitter bots are cool, cool, cool. So today's format will go as follows. First, each person gives about a 5-minute introduction, and we'll start with Ron, we'll go to Toph, then Lori, then Zach. Then we'll look at various clips that the presenters have selected from Don's audio interview, using them as prompts for our own reflections about his scholarship and his teaching. So why don't we start with you, Ron?
Great. Thanks, Roger, for organizing this. And you'd asked in the introduction to sort of give a sense of some memories and experience of working with Don. As with most graduate students, you first get to know a professor through the classroom. Actually, before then, I was at Boston College, and I visited the University of Florida since I was going to come down to live. And I was in my sort of button-down shirt and slacks coming from BC and New England. I'm in Florida and meet Don, who I've just accepted to work with, he's accepted to work with me. He's director of graduate studies, and he's wearing shorts and a tie-dye shirt. And I thought, this is a brilliant contrast, and this speaks volumes about Don, right? The classroom was one in which you just never knew, and I think it probably suffice, you just never knew what was going to happen. And so it was much like a Western in which nothing happens for long periods of time, perhaps the whole class, several classes. It was like waiting for Godot. And then all of a sudden, and out of nowhere, might be talking about a footnote to Narrative Unbound. And the footnote is a page-long footnote. And he just begins to unpack it in some way that seems to connect everything that's relevant about William Blake's studies and Romanticism. And it's coming, it's like this thunderbolt from nowhere. Like trying to figure out how that sort of climate, right? And so a lot of the classroom as a student was preparing for any possibility. And then realizing that all of that would get undermined in some way, right? And then the exercises, the reason that it was really productive for me is the exercises he would give us, like, here's a plate from William Blake, just write about it extensively, or here's a line or two, and just, look at the material structure of this line. Those kinds of exercises were pushing so much what was the norm, particularly at the period in terms of romantic ideology and new historicism. Sort of brought to bear a continental philosophy that wasn't getting a lot of play at the time in Romantic studies.
Awesome.
Going to my experience with Don.
All right, thanks, Ron. That's great. So let's go to Toph.
Okay, so I first met Dr. Ault as a graduate student when I was desperate to find some place that would be able to support my interest in doing comic studies for my dissertation. And one of the things that struck me from the very beginning was kind of like Ron said, just how kind of approachable, informal, and unusual Don was. Something that I deeply admire about his teaching style is he always teaches by inspiration, not by coercion. He has less need to establish authority than anyone else I've ever seen. He actually kind of rejects his own authority, and things come along anyways. And for me, not only have I found both Narrative Unbound and the vector analysis of Barks comics to be incredibly helpful in comic studies, but also has led a good chunk of what I've done with video games, because the same kind of attention to the surface, what Deleuze called the kind of the signifying surface and the logic of sense, that stuff tells you a whole lot about how software interfaces work in a way that neither design thinking nor user experience, UX, tends to get at. And more than anything, more really than anything even to do with my scholarship, Dr. Ault changed my worldview. Or rather, there's this thing that these problems I was working on in terms of my approach to life and my kind of fractured sense of the world that Don's style and also Narrative Unbound in particular validated and explicated in a way I'd never imagined. We are living in a time, as many times are, of apocalyptic thinking. There are all these popular TV shows like Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead are all about the end. And in his discussion of counter-apocalyptic resistances in Narrative Unbound, Don took apart the kind of teleology, the telos of the inevitable end, and shows it as a fantasy of control. It's this desire to have a resolution, even if it's not a happy one or a desirable one, but to know that you control the story and can bring it to a close, or that it will be brought to a close, whether that's according to thermodynamics or your religion or whatever it is. And that would only be the case if the world were this completely consistent place, when it's kind of not apparitional in the kind of phenomenological sense, but for me, it's aporeal, full of gaps, and anything can come out of those gaps. It's to be delusion again, just for a moment. It's kind of like the idea of molar and molecular change and revolution, where these tiny things can kind of expand until they fundamentally change reality. Meanings do that. So when we see characters who in the four Zoas move from being in a narrative bracket in a story that's being told into the stories of their tellers, that's what our own creations of meaning do. Not quite in a physical way, but in an incredibly meaningful one, at least for me. I think I had some other thoughts on that, but I'm sure they'll come out in the course of our conversation. So throwing it back to you, Roger.
Awesome. Lori, you're up.
Yeah, so already really great introductions, and before when we were chatting and talking about sort of our memories of Ault, which are fantastic. I also want to build off what Tiff has said in terms of the inspiration in the teaching. And so I was super excited when Roger proposed this, because we're here today honoring and celebrating the work of Don Ault. And as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, he has and he continues to show us the way to be, changing our worlds, our way of thinking, changing who we are, allowing us to change who we are. Because what he does is he inspires and illuminates a way to pursue our dreams and to make it work. So I have a lot to say always, as Ault has meant and continues to mean so much to my way of thinking for how I am as an academic and what it means in the world when I'm doing public scholarship, community organized, whatever it may be. And so I wanted to frame my quick introduction with a question and a quote from Ibram Kendi, the National Book Award winner. Ibram Kendi asked in a doctoral commencement speech, "Are you an intellectual?" And he explained, "How much you know has no bearing on how much you are as an intellectual. I define, and many others define, an intellectual as someone with a tremendous desire to know. Intellectuals are open-minded. Intellectuals have a tremendous capacity to change their mind on matters, to self-reflect, to self-critique. Intellectuals are governed by only one special interest that is rarely self-serving, the special interest of finding and revealing the truth. Intellectuals are nomadic people, constantly changing their conceptual location, constantly in search of a better conceptual space." So in thinking about are you in, and so that was, Kendi delivers this to people receiving their doctorate. So you've received your doctorate, but are you an intellectual? You know, there are people with medical degrees who are not healers, and there are people with doctorates who are not intellectuals. And so how do we pursue the intellectual life, and how do we really do that and thrive? And that's what Ault opens into, and he opens into all of the beautiful complexity of the world. And so many of these things where we are presented with seemingly simple binaries that are false in their reduction and their oversimplification, Ault explodes out and then offers all of these opportunities for us to engage and brings us into the process. And so for part of my introduction, Ault is one of the reasons I chose to become a librarian, because this is where and how I can do the work I love, the work in public scholarship, or scholarship that's intended for broader impacts for public engagement. And this extends from Ault illuminating a path for excellent, rigorous, passionate work and engaging in popular culture forms. You know, in talking about this setup beforehand, all of us said, well, we didn't really, you know, we now know that there are biases in academia against popular culture, but we certainly didn't know that in Alt's class. You know, the idea that you couldn't study video games wasn't something that would ever come up, or that you couldn't study, of course we were studying comics. Of course this is something we absolutely needed to be doing, and that we needed to engage with cultural forms and in ways that enable others to engage as well. And this has really been pivotal in my thinking about what does it mean to do public scholarship? What does it mean to be an intellectual? It doesn't mean to live only within academia. Certainly that's a place of power, and that's a place where we can do excellent work, focused attention, resources together. But then how do we connect everyone out together with it? And the stories of like, here's when I met Ault before I was a graduate student, and I, like everyone else, I attended one of his classes before I actually took his class. And I also, in our earlier chat, I don't know how many classes I actually enrolled in with him versus how many classes I attended, because he was always, come, you know, of course, life of the mind, come engage with us, send us emails, you know, and all of the materials that he put online. And so how do we break down those borders? How do we use the technologies to connect further? How do we think through what it means to be a scholar, to be an intellectual, and to do this work? And so Don really shows us, and has shown us, and has illuminated the path of showing that another world is possible, and that we can work and dream together to create it. And so I'm excited to get to the rest of the discussion.
Awesome. Zach, bring us home.
All right, I'll try. That was great. Everybody already said a lot of the great things that I kind of wanted to say, so I'll just echo that. But first of all, I want to echo the thanks to Roger for putting this all together and wrangling all the time zones and the logistics of figuring out how we could all have a chance to talk about Don Ault. I was thinking about this as kind of like a nice little reunion in some ways of getting to come together and like many seminars and many conversations that we had. And in terms of thinking back on my experience with Don, so I came to him, and I came to his seminars from new media, and so that kind of like I think Laurie did, and I think I learned about comics, and I learned about Blake, and I learned about these things from him, and it was obviously an incredible and life-changing experience to have him as a leader and a mentor. And in terms of his teaching style, I think some of the things that stand out to me as I was thinking about what to talk about today are like Ron mentioned, the idea that sometimes you just never know what's happening in his seminars or what's going on, or nothing seems to happen for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's this thing, something just suddenly makes sense, and he will go off on some kind of tangent that ends up tying everything back together in a way that seems incredibly improbable until he actually does it. I was thinking of one, I don't remember what seminar this was, but I just remember we were all talking or something. So the conversation had been moving on, and Ault had kind of drifted out of the conversation and started setting up, I think, the Betamax player, and which took him 30 minutes or so to set it up and get it working. And then it was like this documentary on string theory that he wanted to show us. And I think Roger said something like you can never turn your back on Ault in these seminars, because you never know what he's doing. But it was that kind of unpredictability that let all kinds of exciting and interesting things emerge. And that since we're thinking about this in the context of pedagogy, I've been thinking about how my own teaching is influenced by him, and that kind of energetic, fueled by I don't know if it's intense self-deprecatory humor or whatever, the way that he always tends to kind of keep himself out of the, I think Toph put it really well as far as Alt's tendency to avoid being the authority or try to not be the authoritative control. That's something that I definitely take into my teaching, and that I feel like I flourished under that kind of leadership in his seminars, and so I think that's something that I try to emulate. I don't do it well, but I think that when those kinds of moments do emerge, it's always something that reminds me of those moments back then. And also to Laurie's point about never having to, like, we took it for granted that we could talk about comics and video games and hypertext and whatever. It was just like, of course we can, of course it's there, of course we should do it. And I think Alt said, he was probably paraphrasing someone, but he something he said that stuck with me was like, you should never apologize for studying popular culture. Like, you should never defend it. You should just do it, and then your work speaks for itself. And that's it. And that's kind of what I've done, and that's the way I've kind of lived my academic career as far as deciding what to study or what to put in my classes. It just, the work, if it's good, it works, and that's all that has to be there. And so I think it was interesting hearing him talk in his response to us about some of the challenges he faced in getting to teach those things. And it's because he faced those challenges that a lot of us are doing what we get to do today. So that's all, I guess.
That's great. That was awesome. All right. So I have a bunch of these clips, and to give people who may be watching a sense of what's happening here, originally we wanted Don to participate with us, but for a number of reasons it wasn't possible. And so instead what we did is I talked to his daughter, Laura, and she got Welton Wood to, who is a former student of Don's also, to do an interview with him. And I asked, I was like, okay, so don't make this any longer than like 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, so just don't do it like that. And I felt like I was really being generous with that. I didn't know exactly how it would work in the context of this hangout. And he gives me an hour. So I was like, what am I going to do with this? This is awesome. I have no idea. And at the end, he's like, it's really funny if you listen to it, because he wants to go even longer, right? Like you can hear him really struggling to not just talk forever, which is part of what's amazing about him. And so what I did is I have a bit of a playlist. I had it labeled, but I can't seem to find the labels. So what I'm going to do is it's going to be just like these random voices that come out, and I'm gonna play one for you, and then maybe what we can do is just kind of talk about what's occurring here and how it may or may not apply to us, or whatever comes up. So let's see if this works. 1 second. All right, did you guys hear that? No, really?
Something
Okay.
I've done out of desperation hangouts in the past, when I had audio that would only play for me and not over the hangout, is temporarily unplugged my headset to play whatever it was.
We'll do that. We'll try that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone recently asked me is, how do you know that's something you believe in? How that field, how that interest is going to turn into a field of study. And I said, all I can say is that I believed in it And I did everything I could do to make it important.
Okay. That's the one. That's the one skill we do get also that we can identify from Donald's classes. We're all really good at troubleshooting. Like we're really good at it. So it's like instantaneously. Like here comes Toph with a solution. So in this clip, Don's actually talking about comic studies, right? And this question, and I think it comes across a little more in the second clip once we get to it, of how do you know, he worked on comics for decades before people started really publishing in the field. And in addition, I thought one of the things that was interesting was kind of thinking through his early work on Blake and its relationship to comic studies, and how in some ways he used Blake to kind of be able to also do comics. That was really fascinating. Anybody have any thoughts on those themes?
So one of the things that I want to circle back around briefly to what something Zach said triggered for me. This question of Don's work, often he was not overly authoritative, let's say, in the classroom, right? Like just, you know, anything could go and anyone could say anything. And I think it came in part from his work on Blake, where any sense of authority or Urizen, the sort of Urizen figure, was always being undermined. And this worked a lot with, you know, in the 90s, a lot of the Deleuze stuff was getting translated. This idea that where's the space for judgment, right? And what is the sort of common sense and good sense and the sense that's held in common? There's always this sort of idea of a transcendental or transcendent marker of what's good or what's true, etc., in judgment. And it was by that that decisions have been made in criticism, particularly even in Blake criticism. And Don worked really hard to undermine that, not only in scholarship, but also in pedagogy, right? So then when we come to things like what's valuable to study, like comics versus, you know, romantic poetry, the same question of like, well, who gets to decide, right, comes in. And instead what you see in Don is, no, there's no exterior sort of authoritative voice. This is some intuitive belief I have that this can work in a really interesting way. And I'm going to put that out in the world with an incredible intensity. And the intensity becomes this sort of voice for it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Ron. And I think his dedication to that is like so much stronger than mine. Like I feel like I really struggle with that, both in a professional sense and in a personal sense. And so,
but, you know, Roger, in some ways, you know, we're in a world now that's so professionally driven. Like both individually, we're sort of like being professionals and teaching our students and especially our graduate students, like, here's how you become a professional. You attend these things, you check these boxes. And this was, I mean, this is the one thing that Don didn't do, is teach us how to professionalize, right? That was not part of the toolbox. And so you had to figure that part out on your own. Meanwhile, you had all these other tools that other folks didn't have because they were worried about common sense and good sense and staying within sort of the box of academia, right? And checking those boxes. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. What about others? What were your thoughts about this issue of professionalism, authority, the ways that we conceptualized? Because, you know, we're all very different in the type of work that we do, I think, in good ways. And I think in some ways, Don enabled that. But in moments, it was I feel from my own perspective, it was a struggle to find that space.
Well, it's certainly had a huge impact on the way I try to teach and mentor. I mean, teaching, I try to always present authorities in a context and clarify the difference between someone's analysis, however deeply rooted, and the thing they're analyzing, because both of those things will each exceed the other. And you know, and with my graduate students, that doesn't, maybe get this more, but like having faith in them enough to trust that things they want to bring in are relevant, and to guide with an incredibly light hand. And you know, sometimes I found in a practical sense that I've been working with students where I need to provide clearer guidance, but I try to desuppose myself as the authority.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always found so wonderful about Alt was he wasn't just teaching us content, and that's what, you know, the best teachers should do. It's not just about the content; it's also about the method. And you know, later on in the long hour plus interview, he talks about the only thing you can teach is yourself. And so when he's talking about, I believed in it, he was talking about the passion and not only having a reductive, rationalistic, you know, Cartesian worldview where everything can be put in a bureaucratic box and checked off. And that ability to go not just anti, but beyond the structures. And so beyond the box of bureaucracy and professionalism, and you know, we all have to have jobs, or we all have to have ways to feed ourselves. But that's not the only thing that life is for, and it's more than that. And so it moves into conceptions of labor and labor practices and what we do and why we do it and how do we have a fulfilled life. And those questions came up in the class all the time. And what are our passions? What do we, you know, why is this so important to us? Why do we want to learn this? How do we also work together as a team, as a community, to support the technological needs, which we're always failing? You know, I'm very happy that Google Hangouts and other video conferencing now works, but it didn't, you know, for such a long time. And in 2000, 2002, and before that, it was terrible. You know, it was terrible 10 years ago. But Alt was always trying to make it work, and trying to see how we could wield the technology for our needs. And so thinking through all of these different concerns and using comics to think through this in the popular consciousness and for what it meant for all of us. Yeah, I just love that I believed in it.
Cool. I'm going to try to find that quote because I really like the one where the believing in the students is something he talked about for quite a bit. So I'm hoping it's this one. It may not be, but here we go. Let me try it.
By the Stuart Cave, my director, brilliant man, and his faith in me made me realize that this is one way of making students feel comfortable, believing in them, and not a false belief, not a false you know, just to be a nice guy and say, I really trust your work and I think you can do it, is to intuit. And this, I don't know how you can tell somebody to do this, but you need to intuit that there is a kind of spark within the student that is powerful enough to transform what might look like an incoherent situation into a beautiful project.
So that really spoke to me when I listened the first time to the interview, because it's so different, I think, than a lot of ways that graduate students are handled in a lot of universities, right? Because it becomes about I think, at least my sense of it, when I was a graduate student, and when I've seen, graduate students in my own program right now, is that you start out not believing in them, right? You start out not believing in them until they prove something, and then you're kind of like, okay, well, maybe this is all right. And that's like the pedagogical journey. But I feel like something totally different was happening with Ault, which was, connect to something that matters to you, and let's see what happens. Anybody have any sense of how this works, either with in your experience as a graduate student, or maybe if you have been able to mentor or work with graduate students subsequently, what that has looked like to you?
I can jump in. So, graduate students, undergraduate students, all of them. I mean, one of the things, like reading about the best practices for pedagogy and inspiration for pedagogy, some of the things, it seems like somehow we get it in our heads that what we're supposed to do is find the most excellent, the very few that are meant to succeed in our classes, when really our job as teachers is to be able to elicit the wonder that's there in everyone, and to make things really exciting. And I don't think we ever talked about feminist poetry in Alt's classes, but I don't know, like so much of what he says, I hear Audre Lorde in it, and I hear, going back into the chaos, going back into the care and the capacity and the abundance, and having more of us included to expand our world. And that's so much of what he does. And I find that when I allow myself that space of trust when I'm working with students or with colleagues, and I don't have well, let me, you can prove yourself and then we'll see. When I say, I trust you, go with it, really wonderful things happen, and it exceeds any sort of bureaucratic limit, or here's the project, proposal that I would like to expect out of it. And sometimes we do have, outcome-based, I do a lot of grants, I do a lot of budgets, we're going to have those outcomes-based assessments. But if I can, even within those, give people the faith, the space, the trust, that's when things get really, really exciting. And that's where I, again, feel the magic that I felt in his class. And so that's been something that has carried on with me for pedagogy and professionalism, collegiality, being a community member. Yeah.
I have to completely echo the point about trust. I try to come into every new class trusting my students. And if I tried basically, if there's something that to start with, right, to just, whether it's a colleague complaining about a student or a group of students, or it's someone not showing up in the first week of class, I double down on that trust. It's not unlimited. It can't be. It has to not be. But I once heard from another of my mentors that you should teach your best students, not because only your best students matter, but because when you teach to the best that you see coming out of your students, it inspires classes, or at least it can. You then have to put in the work sometimes during office hours and the like to help the students who are like, wait a minute, hold on. We got into this thing Friday and there's this basic concept involved that I'm not sure I get, but it's worth it. And the more, I think that something that's not sufficiently valued in academia today, especially with rising cost of higher education, is the importance of spending 40 years wandering in the desert. I've done that in a couple different points in my academic career, and some of the best things I've gotten from students have come after a certain amount of lost wandering, from mobile survival games to stories about that basically blend Shinto and cyberpunk settings. I could go on, but these things are amazing, but they've all gone through that dark night of the soul. That's part of the process. And sometimes it's longer than others.
All right, let's see if we can do another one. 1 second.
Roger, I don't think we can hear that. I don't know if you're playing it, but I don't think we can hear it. I can't hear anything.
Oh, I had my.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah.
You said you can't. The only thing you can really teach is yourself. Not that you learn yourself from teaching, but that you teach who you are, to teach where you're coming from, how your mind works, what kind of world is it that you live in your mental and physical being. And he said something to the effect that this is what will stick with the students, even though they may learn a great deal of content. And this is
All right. I thought that was, vintage. The mental and physical being, definitely awesome. But as I was playing that this time, I tried to think, and this is something I struggle with because I think it does change this question of what it means to teach yourself. So I think it's absolutely true. One of the things that and I think we also teach our struggles sometimes. Sometimes in good and bad ways, but I think what I have been teaching the past few years is my own struggles with everything that's been happening, and trying to, in some ways, give them a sense of what it means to be compassionate towards one another. At least that's been my goal. And I wonder if you guys can identify what it is about yourself, if anything, that you have found to be important to teach, or what you find yourself even unconsciously kind of teaching as a part of your own practice or your mental and physical being.
So this is something I've been thinking about a little bit this semester or this summer, because I'm teaching an online course for the first time, and I found it very difficult in that context to convey. Well, I didn't have the words for it until Alt's phrasing of it, but I found it difficult to teach myself, or to convey myself, or to kind of be a person in that class in a way that's meaningful to the students. And I think that's the major drawback of online. I mean, I can give them the content and they're doing fine, but there's no there's a big thing missing there, which is the sense of person that I would normally put into a class. And in my own teaching, like that, I think Roger, you mentioned struggles, but I think that's a big part of my pedagogy, is teaching the struggle, especially when I'm teaching technology. I mean, we always joked about Ault having the electromagnetic field that disrupted technology in his vicinity that made it not work. But like the idea, I mean, of him, struggling with the beta player or the laser disc or whatever it was to get it running, like that was still a productive time. Like that was still, those were still good times, and it was still interesting to look at the technology and try to fiddle with it. So in my own classes, when I'm teaching students how to do, set up a Twitter bot or to code a web page or something, like I always, I guess, to go back to the idea of trust. I mean, I trust that if they're not getting it, it's because they're trying, or that they're frustrated, and I understand that frustration, and I try to convey my own frustrations and struggles as well. Like I don't come to them as the master of technology that can do everything, and why can't they keep up? But just coming at it like, here's a tool I've never used before. Let's see if it works. Maybe not, and that kind of attitude, even though in a way the technological context is a bit more prosaic than I think some of the ideas Ault is talking about, as far as like the world that you live in, the universe that you live in individually or whatever. I still think that's a kind of connection and a kind of pedagogy that I take from him, or the idea that it's okay to struggle with stuff. It's okay to not know how it works until you've played with it for a while, or it's okay to kind of be there. And that's helpful in every class I've taught. I mean, that's come into every class. I never thought about it in the phrasing that Ault used there, teaching yourself. But I think that's really valuable and true. And it's also something that I'm struggling with in terms of teaching online, because I don't think it works online. So, or at least I haven't figured out how to make it work.
Really
I don't know
quick,
if any of
Zach,
you have had that experience.
I wonder, like, as you were talking about this, my own interest in technology kind of came after, I mean, I guess I was kind of interested in media when I was there, but mostly I was doing a lot of conceptual work. But the way that you talk about him struggling with his machines makes me think that part of my interest in technology came from those moments. And I'm only kind of now realizing that there was something in like the way that he got it to work or didn't get it to work, or everyone was kind of working together to solve this weird problem that didn't make any sense, that seems to model a lot of things that I really valued later.
Yeah, now that you mention it, it is a kind of media archaeological like object study whenever he brings in like a laser disc and it doesn't work, and we have to try to find all the right cables and, you know, physically position it and at just the right angle where it actually works, or, you know, whatever. And then like the laser disc you'd be playing would be like a digitized copy of a VHS that he taped off of the Disney Channel one night, you know, like it would be something that had all these layers of medial history embedded in it that we would be finally, you know, watching this laser. And then I have a whole shelf of like DVDs that are burned from those laser discs that he, you know, made by recording off of the Disney Channel. And that's great. I mean, I have, but I can't play the DVDs anymore because I don't have a DVD player in my office. It's just like all these layers that he made possible, I guess. Yeah.
And I was going to say, Zach, you know, I spent 7 years mostly teaching online. So sometime you and I should have a conversation, and I'll tell you what I found that seemed to work for me. There are differences, inescapable differences and challenges teaching online. But I found that owning myself, this is something that I do in the classroom too, as thoroughly possible in when I was talking about and around the readings and such, a window to me that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and couldn't get even out of virtual classroom sessions. There's just enough of a remove there. And I think that's like teaching that whole, this idea of teaching the body. One of the things I learned from Dr. Ault, because I arrived at UF after Don had had the first of those series of really difficult back surgeries. And one of the things he taught me just by teaching himself was that your wounds, your vulnerabilities, your incapacities are actually not an impediment to teaching, that they are part of what you teach. So, you know, I talked to my students on the very first day about being non-binary transgender because they obviously see me, and but I also talked to them about my depression, and I, you know, will own my politics, but be very clear that I don't expect them to ascribe to theories or perspectives of mine. And Don taught me how to be vulnerable as a teacher. That was the thing I did not have at all before. I needed to be encased in iron until that point.
Yeah, the point about being vulnerable and the, you know, what Roger had talked about in terms of compassion, I mean, that's the end game, where the overall goal, and it's always in process, and, you know, freedom is a constant struggle. The goal is to always be uplifting compassion and reducing suffering. And we do that in so many different ways and means. And Don, you know, and this, you know, in the later years when he had so many surgeries and he was still trying to drag his cart, you know, with multiple carts, you know, a cart of books, you know, and a cart with the different players and everything on it. And I remember we had schedules, for a number of the semesters, and Walton and others, you know, undergrads and grad students, and we would all like, okay, so we're going to meet at this time to, you know, pick up Don and to go with him to his class, and then we're going to all set it up together. And so that lived materiality of, you know, this is Don's lived body, and this is also our lived classroom community environment, and that he showed us and embodied, and we all did it together, an anti-individual, you know, and the anti-false, we are individual, alone, self-care. No, it's community care. We're taking care of each other, and we're part of the community and part of the compassion. And that's what we do And that's what makes the magic possible of the incredibly rigorous scholarly exchange. And otherwise, if we hadn't come together as a community with that compassion, Don wouldn't have been able to make it to the classroom, you know? And so all of that was necessary as part of the learning and the teaching experience.
Ron,
Yeah,
I know you're about, you want to say something. I just wanted to also, maybe if this is something you can include in what you're about to say, give us some reflections on the other students that you knew maybe when you were at UF, and if there were similar experiences in terms of this kind of multiplicity or multitude of, you know, of intellectual exchanges and things like that. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, you know, it's fine because so much of teaching sometimes is the cult of personalities. So what's interesting about Don, I mean, here we are talking about a personality, sort of figure, a person, but he was doing it in a way that, as many of us have talked about, to do materiality and limits of one's own mind and knowing. And so often in professionalization, we try to sort of more objective idea of, say, British Romanticism, or this is how the digital works, or this is, you know, this is how it is in the field, right? It has this of a something bigger than me, right? But ultimately, and this is the thing that I think Don was so good about, is to highlight that so much of what we know is stuck within our own subjectivity, our own material, our own blindness, insights. And so he's pointing out that we had to come together something and make these things happen, or, you know, as Zach was saying, you know, the machines would break down or just wouldn't work in the field of Ault, and so again pointed out the materiality of things in these sort of media layers. So there is this weird sense of how it wasn't the cult of personality in the sort of traditional, like, sage on the stage kind of teaching, dealing with sort of the realities and limits of knowing, and recognizing, and, you know, a lot of feminist scholarship will do this, recognizing materiality and situatedness. So coming to, you know, to understand our situatedness. You asked about sort of other students in the 90s that worked with Don. And one in particular, Bill Rugg, really stands out to me. And Bill in the 90s was just absolutely an amazing scholar who had intuitive methodology from Don, and really just kind of exploded it out in his own work. And so then you had a sort of group of students who, you know, fed off each other and began to learn outside the classroom based on the same sort of methodology of Don's.
Cool, cool. I'm going to we're going to go forward and get a few more of these clips. These are a little shorter, but still should be pretty interesting. Here they are.
A real guide for me. I was carrying on the work of Blake. I wasn't just analyzing it, but I was creating another text that wouldn't rival Blake, but what it would do would be to augment art.
So he ends up with saying augment. I kind of cut that off, but that was hugely inspirational idea of Ault that actually became very central in my own work. This notion that, especially with Blake, but with a lot of other things, that when we're reading, we're augmenting, we're making something new that wasn't necessarily just interpreting. And I think that's part of the reason why I got into steampunk, because I'm interested in people who did that to the Victorian period. And I can list all of these really interesting moments where that simple idea that he had influenced all of these different things in my own work. Any thoughts from any of the rest of you about this notion of augmenting, making something new with reading?
So it really reminds me of so much, again, feminist scholarship and things more recently where people have been talking about generous interfaces, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick and talking about generous readings, because we're trained to be, it's easy to train, it's much easier to, it's not that it's easy, but it's much easier to train people to be critical and to take something apart and to understand the parts, but then to understand when you put them back together, what does that mean, and how can that be, and what all can that do, and how are the many ways that you can understand it, and that capacity for the augmented or the generous readings, that's a tremendously important thing to teach. Yeah, that's what that strikes for me.
I just was going to say that I've been talking too much, I think, actually. But that Ron mentioned that kind of cult of personality that often surrounds professors. So often there's this kind of expectation that you will follow a instructor's methodology, and that you will quote them, you will use their terms. I felt like I almost had to drag it when I was like, I'm actually going to read all the way through Narrative Unbound. Don kicked on like, you sure you don't have to do this? And in terms of this issue of augmenting text, we are so often taught in grad school how to apply original concepts, but not to create them. There's even in this post-structural world we live in, it's like, you know, the great thinkers of this age have already thought it all out. Don was the one instructor I had who encouraged me to come up with my own concepts. Many of them were garbage, I had to toss them, but I found that liberating.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite quotes from Don. You know, it was from that clip. I thought it was just great how we're so good at critique, but to produce, and the vulnerability of producing something, because then it's out there in the world, and you have to deal with the fact that, you know, rather than just critiquing other people's work, you're actually producing something and carrying on a particular spirit of the work. Like you get this in Deleuze studies a lot, where some people are sort of critical scholars of every detail of Deleuze, and then there are other people who just write in Deleuzian fashion, right? So more the Alfonso Lingus kind of work, or Brian Masumi kind of work, which is a different type of Deleuze studies. So Don was doing that with comics, he was doing that with Blake, and he was doing it way early on, you know, far before this.
Yeah, it really sort of reminded me a lot of some of the things that attracted me to sort of the digital humanities and the making, and the notion that, you know, getting together and producing something was something that you could do. That's something that is very easily connected to Don's work, I think in some ways to Ulmer's work, and also to Deleuze and all of that stuff, which is the things that we were kind of swimming in during that period. So,
Roger, your work is real. I mean, you did like even in the Blake Twitter bot stuff and so forth. And it seemed to me that you were doing stuff where production is critique, or production is a mode of criticism. Do you want to talk any about that and how that sort of flowed from?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. No, yeah. I mean, a a lot of that came from the stuff that Zach was doing on Twitter bots, and also Mark Sample, and several other people who actually have done a lot more in that field than me. But having said that, like I was just really kind of interested in automating the process that Don had described in that clip, right? Like, what if you created something, and I think that when I wrote the article about it, it was more about, in some ways, trying to get out what the meaning of that type of act was, rather than it just sort of being kind of this cool art thing, which I think a lot of Twitter bots are. I think it's also something that those of us in British Romanticist studies who are already thinking about this question of what does it mean for Blake to have a voice, or for us to say that this is what Blake thinks, right? All of those things, I think in my first book, I really sort of critiqued, because if you look at the history of Blake's scholarship, especially the edited editions, they were always changing what Blake was doing. The very first editions by Gilchrist and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, right, were extremely edited, and there's a whole generation of scholars that saw that as this sort of horrible thing, like how dare they change the master's work. And of course, like when I was writing that chapter, I was thinking, and also the Twitter bot stuff, like Don would think this is freaking awesome. Like this is what everyone does, like maybe Rossetti and Gilchrist had nefarious reasons for what they were producing, but it wasn't bad in and of itself. It's actually the thing that all of us do whenever we're interpreting. So I think that idea in and of itself was very central to my Blake scholarship moving forward. But Zach, I want you to talk more about how this worked for you in terms of the way that you moved with Twitter bots and the making of these various different voices.
Sure. Yeah, I certainly like doing Twitter bots, and I like using it in teaching a lot. I like to get my students making Twitter bots for a lot of these reasons, where if you're trying to mimic a certain voice, or if you're trying to create something, or if you wanted to make a Blake bot, for example, you'd have to get to know Blake somewhat as you did that. And then as you produced more Blake, you would be doing that in a programmatic way. And that would be a kind of critique. And I think that's sometimes hard to get across, but I think that's what I mean when I do that in the classroom. I often will put it under an umbrella of creativity for my students, so they can just kind of get their mind around what I'm asking them to do. I'm asking them to be creative, but really I'm hoping that they will be critical in producing these critical apparatuses that then help them understand whatever thing they're working on, whether it's like I don't know, I had one student do a really nice Chuck Tingle bot. I don't know if you know who Chuck Tingle is, but so to do that, we had to kind of deconstruct Chuck Tingle or she had to deconstruct that as a kind of, it's always kind of the same joke over and over again. And then once you figure that out, then you can reproduce it infinitely. And that's what a Twitter bot does, is the same, Twitter bot reproduces the same joke over and over again. But yeah, I think the other thing too, like maybe this is something to segue somewhere else, but I was thinking in terms of he mentioned the image text logo, and I'd kind of forgotten about that a little bit, but the way that and I remember all the endless like conversations we had about it, but I just kind of put it together. But then like he was able, like I put it together in a way that I thought kind of looked neat, and then in talking about it, we realized that it had this kind of this holographemic singularity at its core because of the way that the letter E disappears and then reappears, and that kind of putting it into a practical form through a digital canvas. In that case, I think I was working in Fireworks in the PNG format, and in that case, that made the theory that we'd been talking about in that seminar live inside of this bitmap in a way that was really interesting, and had this kind of point of access to this whole other universe in a way through that one digital file. And I think that's the kind of, those are the kinds of moments that he would look for, that I would recall from the seminars frequently, where that bolt of lightning strikes. But yeah, I think definitely the idea of creation, to go back to his ideas about what he's saying about making something that augments Blake, I think augmentation is I think that's what I want to do in my work, or I think that's what when I do creative kind of works. I think creativity as a word sometimes has some baggage, but I think that when I create things, I feel like that's the kind of thing I want to create. I don't know where I'm going with this actually, but I remember the image text logo in particular being this incredible moment of this holographic concrescence around this letter E, and how there were actually two E's there. Like the one on the left is in the Franklin Gothic font. The one on the right, I think, is Arial because they looked better in the different shadows. And so they're actually two E's that disguise as one, but they only disguise as one in the graphic of it because you don't pronounce the first E anyway because it's silent in the word image. And so it's like this redundant disappearance that reemerges as this other thing that is itself but isn't. Like that's the kind of thing that I liked so much about talking about graphic design with Don Ault. And I'm glad to see that they still use the logo. I mean, I think that's great.
That was absolutely awesome. So what I wanted to mention while you were talking about that, Zach, is two things. One, and I think this is something that a lot of us in English studies broadly, I don't know how we conceptualize ourselves anymore, whatever. But I know that those of us with backgrounds in English or literature often have a really hard time considering ourselves creative, or we think of that as a kind of, I don't know if we think of that as a kind of lesser thing or a greater thing. I think it's both sometimes, but we have a hard time thinking of ourselves as not just writing commentary. Like we're just writing commentary on this person who actually did the writing. And we don't matter as much as, Blake, this figure that we venerate, right? And the other thing that actually your story quite a bit, Zach, about the image text logo reminded me of like Don's relationship to Karl Barks, where Karl Barks would say, "Oh, I just made this thing," and Don would be like, "Oh yeah, it's totally Lacan's real," and Barks is like, "I don't even know what that is." And it's like this kind of, you create this thing and Don's there and he unpacks it. It's already there, but it's this augmentation, right? This idea that this thing can be so much more than we think of it usually every day, and it is. So.
Well, and I think it's worth noting at this point that Don is the least canonical person to teach a highly canonical figure. And that kind of thinking, the creative thinking, I think becomes especially important in moving past only teaching dead white men, which isn't to say we should stop teaching Blake. There's a difference. And in like comics and game studies, I think one of the highest compliments I've received after doing a conference paper is, wow, now I really want to read Too Cool to Be Forgotten, or something else that the person had never heard of before because of the analysis I did of it. I think that's part of that creativity, and I think I see this happening more, whether it's creative commentary or project-based theses. So yeah, at AUT in English New Media, students have the option to do a traditional thesis or a creative project. It's actually called a process-based thesis with an exegesis, something that used to only be done in the arts.
It's kind of reminiscent, I think. I don't know if you guys saw the Sequentials journal that UF just started publishing through the Trace initiative. I'm not really sure what. I know that Sid works with Trace in it, and it does a lot of stuff with New Media and stuff like that. But it's really cool, right? Like it's this journal that's about making comics as forms of scholarship. And it reminded me that there's this whole really interesting conversation on the comics scholarship list where people were like, how do you peer review this? Is this just creative work? And it isn't. It's interesting because, I did that issue, I guess it was about a year ago with Anastasia Salter on comics as scholarship, where we asked scholars to kind of create, what would your argument look like if it were in a comic form? And Nick Sousanis has the book on flattening, which does something similar too. And in each of these, there's a kind of assertion that no, this is a scholarly intervention. Like this is something, envisioning something in a different way isn't just about a form of expression. It changes what is happening. It's changing, you know, the content as well. And so it just sort of reminded me this question of the division between creativity and scholarship. I think is really interesting and odd. I find, you know, and it actually reminded me also of that article you did with Bill and Marcel O'Gorman, Ron, on digging transformation, because that was sort of an early, I don't even know if you ended up publishing it with the Wordsworth Circle, but it was a textual thing. But the original thing was like this hypertext, right?
Yeah, so in that it was for Blake in the 21st century. So it was the MLA at like 1999 or 2000. And the three of us, we had created different threads or vectors, you know, in all sort of language that would follow different elements of Blake. And so you could click on and follow different vectors and directions and kind of get lost and immersed and overwhelmed in the text, which was an experiential knowing and learning, very much like being in a Blakean text. So then we presented it, and so we had three different voices that would weave in and out. All three of us were there. But then we had to do a print version for the Wordsworth Circle. So we had these icon symbols that you could read, either, you know, paragraphs with icon symbols starting it. So you could choose which paragraphs you wanted to read or thread them and so forth. So it was playing with that sort of materiality stuff. And I was thinking that, you know, Marcel O'Gorman's gone on to do work. He has a lab for critical media, as many, you know, there are a number of these labs now. And critical media scholarship has gone to a lot of production, right? And production, recognizing production and even material production as modes of thinking. And this is something I think Don has always been very good about, is to open up what constitutes thought, right? And so sometimes he would look at a blot or a period or some kind of mark or erasure, and that constituted thought in a different way, right? And so he was always working through that. And then even playing with, in Narrative Unbound, playing with the marginalia of a book, or using mathematical formula within a book, you know. So all of this were different ways in that undermined a particular sort of structure, a safe structure of knowledge. And also took that sort of very Blakean approach of anti-authoritarian, new DIY methods of printing or creating in order to express something new, right? And so he's really sort of pushed that, and I think many of the folks who've worked with him have sort of continued along those lines. And in some ways, he was untimely in that way, you know, like now a lot of people are doing that, but he was doing it much earlier, right?
Cool. Let's go further. We still have two more. Here's number 7.
In my understanding of the Four was there is no underlying world except at what comes into existence at the moment that it is narrated. And so there's no pre-existent. And there was something about the way Barks drew things that made it impossible to create three-dimensional models of it. In fact, when Barks himself was commissioned to do three-dimensional models, he could do those that were perfect. Certain points of view, but there were certain points of view from which you couldn't even recognize it.
Okay, that's awesome. I mean, this is definitely something that is central to, you know, the work that Toph's been talking about and has worked with himself. But I think it's, you know, it's generally also applicable to this, all of these things that we've been discussing today, this question of an attention to the kind of materiality of thought, you know, that thought isn't just something that is immaterial, it's something that occurs and as an event, and that is made up of actors, right? And that, you know, the different ways we represent things have an impact on what they are. And so I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about if the ways in which that model, that idea of transforming from one medium to another, and the impact of representation and existence informed your work or your teaching, or either.
I guess I'll start. I mean, the thing about what is, I kind of first thought when in Don's explication of Blake's line, not a line. Wait, it's not a line is drawn without intention. Not a blade of grass is without significance. And the fact that those two things are different, that you can there's significance in everything, and when there's a human hand, there's intent. But that, going back to that bit from the Four Zoas there, it isn't, there may be some sort of, there can be an imaginary world that's consistent as a frame of reference. That's one of the things I think that Don talks about in the difference between like Karl Barks stuff, where Duckburg has its own consistency. But that consistency is gappy, because with all respect to Don Rosa's stories filling in the gaps in the Scrooge McDuck's history are perhaps actually a Narrative Unbound like work that goes alongside, but they are not a pasting in. They don't fill those gaps. Those gaps remain, and it was that very gappiness, that openness, that was actually, for me, in addition to everything it's meant to me academically, you know, I wasn't out. I wasn't even sure of how to define myself when we were both graduate students with Don at AUT. You know, earlier you referred to me with the male pronoun, which is totally understandable. People who know me, hey, when you've known someone for years using one set of pronouns, it is so hard to change. It just is. And so it slips out. But a measure of freedom to feel like I could change, that the things that felt like gaps and emptiness were productive gaps. It frankly, in the end, it may have saved my life, because I've certainly, you know, you hear this all the time from transgender people. There's something like a 40% attempted suicide rate. It's crazy. I'll hand this over to someone else now.
Yeah, I mean, I just came back this morning from being at the CLIR postdoctoral fellows meeting yesterday. So those are the Council on Library and Information Resources. It's a way to diversify the workforce in libraries and also show people the plethora of job markets that exist and opportunities for humanities PhDs. It's not just the one job market, whatever one that might be with AHA or MLA or the others. But the many job outcomes and many possibilities. But the entire graduate student experience it's traumatic for everyone. You know, it's traumatic, it's depressing, it's a PTSD experience, it's so grueling and it's so difficult. And the openness that is there is often openness that is vague, and that hurts people. And so, you know, a lot of my work is incredibly bureaucratic, putting, you know, policies in place. I'm a sort of an honorary member of our HR and fiscal office. But at the same time, that's always grounded in the capacity and care. And what does this mean? And how do you just be there for someone? And that's one of the things that Ault was just there with the texts. And he was also there with us in a way that I would think that he has saved many lives, you know, and enriched, I mean, all of us. I mean, we're doing this today because of, you know, we've had such wonderful experiences with him and with each other, from the conditions that he put in place for that community to foster and to thrive.
It's amazing. It reminded me when both of you were talking, some of the things that, you know, probably many of us have been struggling with. I struggle with a lot of anxiety disorder, I think. And some of that is, you know, just normal craziness of academia. But, you know, there are other aspects of it that are sort of beginning to make me question things about masculinity. There's something about masculinity that's all about covering up gaps, right? And not attending to the gaps that erupt in front of us that can be extremely violent. And so, you know, there are moments whenever you are confronted with difference, where those aspects of your life are like screaming, and you're trying to keep a brave face, and it's creating a kind of very violent disjunction. And you know, the way in which Don was able to say it's okay to like talk about that disjunction, I think was extremely powerful. And it's something that I continue, you know, as we saw today with Toph. And I apologize, Toph. I know that I know what you said, and we both try to, you know, cover it over, but all of us struggle with, you know, the lingering after effects of the various ways in which our culture has not only shaped us, but kind of beaten us into existence, right? And so, yeah, all you can do is point out those disruptors and celebrate them and enable yourself to not always be whole, because that's kind of almost always the most violent thing.
Yeah, you know, one of the great sort of elements of Don's work was in Blake's studies, there are those who believe there was a world before the fall that was whole, and then, you know, the characters are trying to scramble, and then there's Don, who's like, no, there was nothing before. It's what's happening in the text. And he radically took on the question of time and these disjunctions in time. With ideas of narrative and structure that so much of Blake's studies had been built on, and then of course comic studies as well. And in some ways he was drawing from Whitehead as well, something we hadn't talked a lot about. But you know, he was doing Whitehead, he was doing the 70s Whitehead, the 60s, 70s Whitehead. And then no one heard of Whitehead for 80s, 90s, it was like all underground. And then, you know, Deleuze's work on the Fold gets translated again, and all of a sudden people are talking about Whitehead in the 2000s. And Whitehead continues to be hot today. And I guess since where Don had found these moments, these really radical moments, and through mathematics, expressions in mathematics, like yours in 1, yours in 2, yours in 3, and all these sort of iterations. And as a way of expressing radical disjunctions in narrative in Blake that then began to reflect in the classroom, in our personal experiences, and just kind of had these rippling effects. I would say so much so that I'm running a conference in the fall called Out of Time, right? Which is non-human and other outlets. So it's, you know, I think we still wrestle with this question of time.
Okay, so I suggest that I think there's one more clip, if I'm not mistaken, and then maybe we can do kind of a conclusion. I haven't really thought about how to conclude this, but if you want to think about it while we're talking about this last section, that would be awesome. So here it is.
And in my understanding of the four resolves,
Oh no!
there is no underlying will.
That's the last one. I skipped over one. I thought I skipped over one. Okay, but why don't we just give like one final thought about Don and maybe his legacy in our own minds and who we are as scholars and teachers and librarians and people. You want to go, or I can go?
Yeah, I mean, any order, like, we're all going to say, you know, gushy, you know, important, the fact that we're doing this, you know, and that we were also thrilled to listen to, you know, an hour of Don interviewed by Walton, you know, another graduate student, and, you know, Stephanie's not here with us today because she's traveling, but another graduate student, you know, and another graduate student who's also wasn't able to be here on the Hangout today. And those were the small circle, you know, that you queried to do this. Seeing in terms of his impact, his legacy, and his, you know, the lines of flight that and the constellations and the amplification that are within all of us and that we're all sharing with our students. And as we talk about pedagogy and we talk about capacity and care and how we do this with compassion and, you know, intellectual rigor and inspiration and intuition, going with the rational, but beyond it and through it. And that's what Don gave us a chance to see how good it could be. And then that's what we want for everyone. You know, if you get a little taste of what freedom feels like, you want it not just for yourself, you want it for everyone. And that's awesome, you know, and that's why we're all here today. So.
Yeah, I'll to just sort of follow up on that, say that Don provided a type of radical hospitality. So there, you know, again, these questions of judgment or authority were really undermined by his ability to be hospitable to all comers, not just things that are friendly or things that are kind, but to radically take on large questions, whether it's time or personhood, or questions of authority, or what's right, or what are graduate things, or what some sort of authoritative scholar thinks. Radical hospitality to bring these things together, to have the conversation of incommensurables, you know, the conversation of the community of those who have nothing in common. It's really, really quite beautiful.
I'll go ahead. I wanted to sort of read a little selection, and I included this in my letter, but it really, when I was researching for this Blake and Pedagogy special issue I did about a year ago, I was reading all this stuff about Blake himself as a teacher, and it was so oddly uncanny to my experiences with Don. And so I thought I'd read a little bit of that as a way of talking about him. So George Bentley starts out by saying, and this is from his biography of Blake, Stranger from Paradise, that Blake was clearly a natural teacher and was probably far more involved with teaching than we have any direct evidence for. And so like this idea, I mean, obviously, you know, it may not be very similar, but this idea that he taught by sort of existing, I think, is something that's really sort of resonating for me. So there are several episodes from Blake Records where he talks a bit about these moments of teaching that are really kind of fascinating. So George Richmond, one of his students at one point, complains that he was having difficulty finding inspiration for a painting that he was creating for Blake. And Blake responds by turning to Catherine, his wife, and says, it is just so with us, is it not? For weeks together, when the visions forsake us, what do we do then, Kate? To which Catherine Blake responds, we kneel down and pray, Mr. Blake. And there's another one where a young Samuel Palmer talks about first meeting Blake, being struck by his fixed gray eyes, as well as a question that Blake asks him, do you work with fear and trembling? Palmer responds that he does, and Blake remarks, then you'll do. And apparently, the last one that I wanted to share is he gets invited by this rich family to teach painting to their kids, but it wasn't very profitable. Apparently, Frederick Tatum recounts that he couldn't actually get to the teaching. So this is what Tatum says. He says, it wasn't very profitable, quote, for after his lesson, he got into conversation with his pupils and was found so entertaining and pleasant, possessing such novel thoughts and such eccentric notions, together with such jocose hilarity and amiable demeanor, that he frequently found himself asked to stay to dinner. Thus he stopped whole days from his work at home. As the story goes, Blake was subsequently, quote, recommended and nearly obtained an appointment to teach drawing to the royal family. But of course, this shocked rather than delighted Blake, who quickly became worried that he would have been expected to have lived in comparative respectability, not to say splendor, a mode of life, as he thought, derogatory to the simplicity of his designs and deportment. And so, like, you have this image of Blake, right, as this guy who is immediately strikes you, right, when you first meet him. And we all have these stories of Don, of just kind of having this moment where you're like, who is this guy? Like, what? And then in class, having these conversations that don't seem to be don't seem to come to any conclusion whatsoever, but they seem to change our lives. And then this idea that he's so connected to his ideas and his visions that they're the most important thing to him, and that making more money or having a job, of course, Don had a job, right? But it wasn't his main focus. And so it was just very interesting to me, all of these elements, as I was researching this, finding these crazy parallels between Don and Blake himself that were just really amazing. So.
Well, on the topic of kind of liberation, this kind of talking about master narratives and decolonizing decolonizing the Occidental white tradition as well as addressing the ills of colonialism. There's this thing that Don pulls out of Blake that is so important. The Four Zoas just tears apart the idea that Narrative Unbound and the Four Zoas as a text, as an illustration, tear apart the idea that Blake was working within a master narrative. And most of the stories we get out of mainstream media are still taught to specific master narratives. I've worked with my field teaching screenplays to know that Joseph Campbell's mythic cycle with various degrees of additional prescriptions added on is how Hollywood movies are made. But, Blake was part of the white Western canon of dead men is. It just so happens that all of us in this panel today are white, just to let that not be an elephant in the room. But the approach and methodology is something that helps level things out in terms of the way that other cultures and other traditions have been reduced, have been placed as other, because I've applied, and I've found it very helpful in talking to students. Like one I've got who's working on a video game based on a specific Maori mythic cycle that's part of his iwi. the way that someone can be, their bones can be melted down and forged into something, and then you see the character again doing something else because of the post-apocalyptic sense of the text. They're being forged into something doesn't prevent them from doing something else. Is important. You're talking about story cycles and breaking away from the idea that stories are only good if they are coherent and unified and ascribed to a master narrative, that diversity of stories, conflicts in stories, paradoxes in stories are perhaps the more human thing, the more meaningful thing.
So I guess as we're trying to, as we're moving to the end, I've been trying to think about other things we haven't quite, if there is anything we haven't touched on yet about Don Ault that kind of let us all be who we are and here in this moment together talking about him. I think I guess one thing that occurred to me is his kind of relentless optimism, I guess. I mean, he talked a little bit about that, like having faith in students and you know, when you see the spark, kind of knowing that it's there and letting it happen. But if you think about, that's what struck me too in listening to his audio response is like, I mean, if you hear him, he's still talking about returning to the Yersian equations. Like he's still thinking, you know, if I have some time, maybe I can get back to that. And like, there's always that project, you know, there's always something, whether it's the revisions of visionary physics or, you know, the next, you know, he's always got, and to me, like that idea of it is just sort of his, you know, his personality and you know, he's always got something on the something in progress. But that idea of like the thing always being in progress, or the idea of the knowledge or the narrative or the thing, the world always being a process of becoming the thing. It's never the thing itself. I think that maybe that's another way to kind of go off of what Toph you were saying about the avoidance of, that's a way that his resistance to a master narrative kind of shows up in his own life and his own habits. And it also informs his generosity towards us and his, you know, compassion, but is also, it basically that idea of optimism in the face of, as we all saw, some really, you know, alarming health problems and other things that he struggled with and brought to us, or that, and I assume he's still going through things. I mean, he often joked or made a joke about sort of always being on the edge of oblivion. It seemed like with his health, and yet in the face of that he was able and always was reworking visionary physics at the same time. Like that's the kind of optimism and attitude that I think I hope I try to have in my life, I guess. But yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for an amazing conversation. This is, wow, this like really reminds me a lot of our courses and the insights you had and the funny, weird moments and the challenges and the all of the things that came together were really outstanding. And thank you, Lori. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Toph. Thank you, Zach. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Roger, for putting this together, and thanks to Don.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Don.
Lovely, absolutely lovely.
All right, take care, guys.
You too.
Bye.
Word can undo the effects. Entombed in disappointments, falling to our knees out of habit, the squirrel moves in the wind-blown grass, scurries from tree to tree.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointment.